A man walked out of the Black Hills with nothing but the dust on his feet and a hole in his soul. His name was Elias Rohr, and in the late summer sun of 1878, he looked more like a ghost than a man. Barefoot, shirt torn, with the kind of haunted eyes that had seen the world swallow everything he'd ever loved. In his arms, he carried the only two things he had left, Clara and James, 2 months old, so small they fit in the curve of his elbows, wrapped in a single faded flour sack blanket. Their cries were weak, thin whispers of hunger that cut him deeper than any knife. He'd walked for days, driven by a promise he'd made to a ghost in a collapsed mineshaft. He crossed the plank bridge into Deadwood, a town built on gold, greed, and desperation. The boards groaned under his weight. The air smelled of pine, coal smoke, and the cheap whiskey that washed away men's dreams. Nobody stopped him. Nobody offered a damn thing. They just watched. Eyes followed him from saloon doorways and mercantile steps, cold and hard as river stones. He could feel their judgment, their pity, their suspicion. A man with 2 starving babies and no wife was a problem. And in Deadwood, problems had a way of disappearing. He kept walking until he saw her. Down at the creek landing, a woman knelt over a washboard. Scrub, ring, snap. The rhythm was steady, strong. Her forearms glistened in the sun. A line of clean shirts flapped in the breeze behind her, white flags of surrender to a hard life. He didn't know her name, didn't know she was a widow named Lydia Mae Carter, a woman folks whispered was barren, unlucky, a ghost in her own right. All he knew was that she was his last hope. He stopped at the edge of the creek bank. His voice was a low rasp, cracked from thirst and grief. "Please," he said, the word catching in his throat. "Feed my hungry twins." He paused, gathering every last scrap of his strength, and made a promise that would change everything. A promise so wild, so desperate, it could only be made by a man with nothing left to lose. "I will shelter you forever." That was it. No bargaining, no fancy words. Just the raw, brutal truth of his situation laid bare on the banks of Whitewood Creek. An offer of a lifetime of protection from a man who couldn't even protect himself. It was insane. It was impossible. And yet she looked up, her eyes level and still, took him in. The torn shirt, the bare feet, the exhaustion carved into his face. But most of all, she saw the babies. She saw Clara's tiny fist twitching against his chest, and James's pinched, pale face. She didn't ask where he'd come from, didn't ask who the mother was, didn't ask how he planned to keep a promise when he didn't even own a pair of boots. She just rose. Wiping her wet hands on her apron, she walked up the bank and held out her arms. It was a gesture of such simple, profound trust, it nearly brought him to his knees. He shifted Clara into her embrace, then James. The babies settled against her, as if they'd been waiting for her their whole short, miserable lives. They quieted instantly, sensing a safety he could no longer provide. Without a word, she turned and led him away from the creek, up a narrow path that snaked between the backs of saloons and gaming halls. The tinny sound of a piano tumbled from an open doorway. Men shouted and laughed on the street, but in this small procession of 3 adults and 2 infants, there was only silence. She took him to a small room tucked behind the shuttered Chinese laundry. It wasn't much. 4 walls, a cot, a small stove, and a crate for a shelf. But it was clean. It was safe. She laid the twins on the cot and unwrapped them from the dirty sack blanket. Her hands were gentle but sure as she checked them for fever, her touch light as a prayer. From a high shelf, she pulled down a tin of condensed milk. In a place like Deadwood, that was as good as gold. She opened it with the back of a spoon, mixed it with warm water from a kettle, and fashioned a nipple from a boiled strip of clean cloth. Elias stood in the doorway, a giant of a man made small by circumstance, watching her every move. He was a miner, a timberman. He knew how to swing an axe, how to read the rock. But this delicate act of keeping 2 tiny heartbeats going, he was utterly lost. Clara drank first, her little throat working, her breath catching between swallows. It was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. "Name?" Lydia asked, her voice soft. "Elias Rohr." "I am Lydia Mae Carter." He hesitated, the next words tasting like ash in his mouth. Mora, my wife. She was, she was in the timberline shaft when it came down. They dug for 2 days. He stopped, swallowing a knot of grief so thick it choked him. The babies came early. I don't know how to keep them. Lydia didn't offer pity. Pity was cheap. Instead, she offered something real. She handed him James when it was his turn to feed, showing him how to hold the bottle, how to keep the boy from choking. His big, calloused hands trembled, but he did it. As James drank, a fraction of the tightness in Elias's chest eased. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of something that wasn't despair. But in Deadwood, hope is a dangerous thing. Just as the last of the milk was gone, a shadow fell across the doorway. A big, square-built man with a badge polished brighter than his soul filled the frame. Sheriff Danvers. He didn't knock. He didn't ask. He just slapped a piece of paper against the doorframe. By order of the camp board, he read, his voice flat and bored. Unauthorized encampments along Whitewood Creek are to be cleared by the 15th. Water use is leased to Boone Consolidated. Trespassers will be fined and jailed. His eyes flicked from the notice to the babies on the cot, then landed on Elias with cold contempt. Move by the date, Danvers snarled, or I'll move you. He turned and left without another word, the eviction notice fluttering in the draft like a dead leaf. Elias's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. He had found a moment of peace, a breath of air in a drowning world. And now this. Now a man named Boone, a man he'd never even met, was going to take it all away. Lydia looked from the notice to Clara, who was sleeping with a speck of milk on her lips. She looked at Elias, at the fury and fear warring in his eyes. Eat something, she said, her voice impossibly calm. She handed him a heel of bread wrapped in a cloth. Then she did something that stunned him. She picked up a hammer and a handful of nails, and she nailed the door shut from the inside. It wasn't a fortress, but it was a statement. This is our place now. You want it, you'll have to break it down. Outside, somewhere up on the dry hillside, a stray spark from a passing ore cart landed in the brittle grass. It was small, barely a flicker, but it caught. It glowed, and it began to creep through the darkness, slow and steady and hungry. Inside, Elias took the bread in one hand, the hammer in the other, and began the work of keeping a promise he had no right to make, a promise to shelter her forever. He just didn't know that forever might only last until morning. The first day in that small, sealed room felt like the first day of a new world. The sun came up, casting slivers of light through the cracks in the walls. Elias was up before it, his hands itching for work. A man like him, he wasn't built for sitting still. He was built to build, to protect. He gently unnailed the door and stepped out into the damp alley. He knew where he was going. He walked, still barefoot, to the blacksmith's forge at the edge of town. The clang of a hammer on steel was already echoing through the morning mist. Jonah Pike, the blacksmith, was a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He rarely spoke, letting his hammer do the talking. Elias had known him years ago, back when they both worked timber before Elias followed the promise of gold into the earth. I need roof boards, Elias said straight out. No time for pleasantries. Jonah set his hammer down. The sudden silence was heavy. He looked at Elias's bare feet, at the raw scrape on his cheek, at the exhaustion that clung to him like mine dust. A roof, Jonah grunted, his voice a low rumble. Don't come free. I can work it off, Elias said, his voice steady. He wasn't begging. He was offering a trade. I just need to keep the wind out of a room where 2 babies sleep. Something shifted in Jonah Pike's hard eyes. He was a man who understood the simple, brutal math of survival. A roof for 2 babies. That was an equation he could solve. Behind the shed, he said, turning back to his forge. Stack of pine offcuts. Take what you can carry. Nails too. But you straighten them yourself. It was more than charity. It was a sign of respect. Elias hefted a load of pine boards onto his shoulder, the sharp smell of resin filling his lungs, a smell that reminded him of a life before the darkness of the mine. He carried the wood back through the waking town, a man with a purpose again. When he got back, Lydia had a kettle on the stove and was peeling thin slivers from a willow branch. For James, she explained without looking up, keeps the fever down. A small pot of cornmeal porridge was bubbling on the stove, filling the tiny room with a sweet, warm smell. It smelled like a home. Elias didn't waste a moment. He climbed onto the roof and began the slow, careful work of patching the holes. Thud, thud, thud. The sound of his hammer was a declaration. I am here. We are here. We are not leaving. By noon, the worst of the leaks were covered. The wind that had howled through the gaps was now just a whisper, but just as one threat was quieted, another appeared. A man came walking down the creek path. He was Lakota, his long braids streaked with gray, his face a map of seasons and sorrows. His name was Red Elk, and he moved with a quiet dignity that made the noisy town seem small and foolish. He stopped at Lydia's door. He carried a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. He handed it to Lydia. For the cough, he said, his voice like stones rolling in a deep river. Inside were 2 pouches of herbs, dried mint, and chokecherry bark. Elias climbed down from the roof, wiping sweat from his brow. Red Elk looked at him, then at the freshly patched roof. You work hard, he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement of fact. Then he looked toward the creek, his eyes hardening. But know this, Whitewood Creek does not belong to Silas Boone. This water was shared long before his men and his papers came. We dug these banks. We cleared the ice. That is the law, an older law. Elias nodded slowly. Then he's breaking it. Boone breaks many things, Red Elk said, a cold fire in his eyes. He gave a slight nod and walked on, leaving his words hanging in the air like a prophecy. The prophecy didn't take long to come true. Less than an hour later, 3 men in company coats marched up the alley. They carried red-topped stakes and heavy mallets. They didn't speak to Lydia or Elias. They didn't even look at them. They just started pounding the stakes into the ground, right along the back wall of the room. Thud, thud, thud. It was a different sound from Elias's hammer. This was the sound of theft, of power, of a line being drawn in the dirt. What's this? Elias demanded, stepping forward. The tallest of the men glanced over his shoulder, his face blank. Marking company land. Boone Consolidated owns to the creek bank. This room's been here longer than Boone's claims, Elias shot back, his hands curling into fists. Not my concern, the man said, driving another stake. Sheriff Danvers says it's company land now. You've got it till the 15th. They finished their work and left, the line of red stakes a fresh wound on the earth. Elias stood there, shaking with a rage he couldn't unleash. He had just built a roof to keep the rain out, and now another man was stealing the very ground beneath their feet. The stakes didn't just mark the land, they started the whispers. On the boardwalk outside the Mercantile, 2 women mending clothes spoke just loud enough for Lydia to hear as she passed. Taken in a man she barely knows, one clucked. And those babies aren't even her blood, the other added. It ain't decent. A woman should wait for a preacher's word. Lydia heard them. Her back stiffened, but she kept walking, her face a calm, unreadable mask. Elias heard it too, up on the roof, hammering the last board over the stove vent. The words were like poisoned darts, aimed at the one person who had shown him kindness. That night, after the babies were asleep, the lamplight turned the small room into a sanctuary. They'll talk, Elias said, his voice low and rough. They'll talk till they find some other bone to gnaw on. He looked at her, his gaze intense. I told you before, I'll shelter you. You, Clara, James. From wind, from rain? He paused. From them. Lydia met his eyes across the small space. And from Boone? If it comes to that, he said, and it was not a threat, but a solemn vow. The air outside grew cold. The wind slid down from the hills, carrying the scent of dry pine and a coming storm. Up on the hillside, that one tiny, forgotten spark had been busy. It had crept through the dry grass, finding pine needles, then a fallen branch. It was no longer a spark. It was a small, hungry snake of fire, slithering unseen in the darkness. Inside, Elias checked the latch on the door he'd just rehung. Lydia poured the last of the porridge into a tin bowl. For a moment, there was peace, but the wind was shifting, and the fire was waiting. Just past midnight, the wind changed. It came in from the southwest, a dry, angry hiss that tore through the gulch. It found the smoldering patch on the hillside and breathed life into it. The small snake of fire became a dragon. Thin orange tongues licked up the slope, tasting the dry pine needles, growing bolder with every bite. By the time the first rooster crowed, a wall of flame was roaring at the top of the ridge, painting the pre-dawn sky a terrifying, bloody red. Deadwood woke up choking on smoke. The air was thick with the crackle of burning trees and the sharp, terrifying smell of pine resin bursting in the heat. Men stumbled into the main street, pulling on boots, their faces pale in the hellish glow. The fire was moving fast, chasing the wind, rolling downhill straight toward the creek, straight toward the row of shacks and sheds where they lived. Elias was on the roof in an instant, his heart pounding against his ribs. He saw it all. The fire wasn't just a threat, it was a predator, and they were its prey. Lydia was already at the door, the twins wrapped and held tight in her arms, her eyes narrowed against the smoke. "That wind's bringing it right here," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. He was off the roof and running before she finished the sentence. He didn't run away from the fire. He ran toward the east end of town, toward the old Sioux diversion ditch that fed into the creek. He knew it was their only chance. Jonah Pike was already there, his massive shoulders working a shovel, his face grim. Red Elk stood beside him, impossibly calm, his eyes fixed on the fire's advancing edge. "That gate still sound?" Elias yelled over the roar. "It'll hold," Red Elk answered, "but Boone's men put a lock on it when they claimed the water." "To hell with Boone!" Elias spat, grabbing a crowbar from Jonah's wagon. The three of them, the miner, the blacksmith, and the Lakota elder, threw their weight against the lock. Metal screamed in protest, then snapped. Together they heaved on the huge wooden lever that controlled the gate. With a deep groan of ancient, waterlogged timbers, the gate lifted. Cold mountain water, held back for weeks, surged into the dry ditch. It foamed and roared, a wild thing unleashed, cutting a new path toward the lower creek and the line of fire. "You know what they'll call this," Jonah shouted, his voice barely audible over the torrent. "They can call it theft," Elias yelled back, his face streaked with soot. "Better theft than ashes." Downstream, the sudden flood of water hit the fire line with a furious hiss. It was a battle of elements, fire against water, greed against survival. Men with wet sacks and shovels ran to meet the water, beating back the flames as the current soaked the dry earth, creating a firebreak. But not everyone wanted the fire stopped. High on the opposite ridge, a man on a fine black horse watched the scene unfold. It was Silas Boone. He sat perfectly still, his expensive coat buttoned to his throat, his arms folded across his chest. The firelight danced in his cold, calculating eyes. "Let it clear itself," he said to the foreman beside him. "Less trouble for the graders when we start to build." He saw the shacks and the people as nothing more than debris to be swept away. But the water, the stolen water, was stronger than his ambition. It turned the black, burning earth to mud, starving the flames. The fire's advance was halted just yards from the first row of homes. Just as Elias thought the worst was over, a woman's scream cut through the noise. He spun around and saw Lydia, a phantom in the thick smoke, sprinting toward the far end of the creek row. A small wooden house there was already engulfed, flames crawling up its walls, and from inside he could hear the high, thin cries of a trapped child. His blood ran cold. Before he could even move, Lydia did something that would be talked about in Deadwood for years. She ripped a blanket from a clothesline, dunked it in the muddy creek water, and threw it over her head and shoulders. Without a moment's hesitation, she ran straight into the burning house. The smoke swallowed her whole. For a terrible, endless second, Elias couldn't breathe. The fire, the smoke, the roar of the water, it all faded away. There was only the black doorway of that burning house. Then she emerged, a figure from a legend, face black with soot, hair coming undone, but her eyes were blazing with fierce protective light, and clutched in her arms was a small coughing girl, alive. The town had its heroes now, the men who opened the gate, and the woman who walked into fire. The crisis was over. By afternoon, the wind had shifted, and the fire was reduced to a smoldering memory. Elias was leaning against a post, trying to catch his breath, when he saw them coming. Sheriff Danvers and two deputies. They walked down the muddy bank, their boots squelching in the ash. Danvers' badge caught the afternoon light, winking like a false promise. Elias Roar, Danvers said, his voice oozing with a smug authority he'd never earned. You're under arrest. Elias wiped a smear of soot from his face. Arrest? For what? Theft of company property, Danvers said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. That water you stole, and obstruction of lawful orders. That water saved half this town, Elias said, his voice dangerously low. It wasn't yours to take, Danvers sneered. Jonah Pike stepped forward, his huge frame blocking the sheriff's path. It wasn't Boone's either. Danvers ignored him. He pulled a length of chain from his belt. Hands. Lydia, with the rescued child still clinging to her skirt, and her own twins now safely in the arms of a neighbor, started toward them, her face a mask of cold fury. Elias caught her eye and gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Stay with Clara and James, he mouthed. I'll be back. The cold metal of the chains bit into his wrists. Danvers shoved him toward a waiting wagon. As he was pushed forward, Elias looked up at the ridge. Silas Boone was still there on his black horse, a motionless shadow against the smoky sky, watching the arrest as if it were the final act of a satisfying play. As the wagon jolted away, Elias locked eyes with Lydia one last time. She stood in the wet black ash, the twins now back in her arms, a rescued child at her side, her hair blowing in the smoky wind. She was the queen of a ruined kingdom, and her eyes promised him one thing. This was not over. Justice in Deadwood wasn't served in a courthouse. It was served in the Golden Nugget Saloon, between the poker tables and the long oak bar. The next morning, the tables were pushed against the walls, and a plank laid across two barrels served as a judge's bench. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and nervous sweat. Elias stood before the makeshift bench, his wrists free but his shoulders rigid with defiance. Sheriff Danvers stood by the door, his hand resting casually on the butt of his Colt, a guard dog waiting for a command. And in the center of it all, preening like a rooster, was Silas Boone. His coat was pressed, his hair was oiled, and he held a sheaf of papers like a royal decree. He was the king in this shabby court, and he knew it. The judge was a freighter named Willard Phipps, a man chosen because he was sober and could read without moving his lips. He rapped a spoon against the plank. The room fell silent. Charge against Elias Roar, Phipps read, squinting at a piece of paper. Theft of company water. Plaintiff, speak your piece. Boone rose, milking the moment. Gentlemen, he began, his voice smooth as snake oil. The water in Whitewood Creek is under exclusive lease to Boone Consolidated by authority of a territorial charter. He held up a document with a fancy red seal. This paper is the law. Any diversion of that water is theft. Plain and simple. This man, he pointed a manicured finger at Elias, is a thief who endangered my property with his recklessness. He handed the paper to Phipps, who looked at it like it might bite him. Before Boone could continue his performance, a new voice cut through the silence. That paper is not the only law in these hills. Red Elk stepped forward from the back of the room. He moved with a quiet power that made Boone's blustering seem cheap. He held a folded piece of oilcloth, worn soft with age. He carefully unfolded it. On it were names, dozens of them, signed in different hands in different languages. Lakota, French, English. This, Red Elk said, his voice resonating through the saloon, is the agreement made when the first people came to this creek, before Boone, before the charter. The water is to be shared. The people work the ditch together. This is the law of this land, older than any paper from a distant city. Boone sneered. Old stories and handshakes have no place in a modern court of law, old man. But before he could dismiss it, another voice joined the chorus. My husband's name is on that agreement. Every head turned. Lydia Mae Carter stepped forward. She looked small next to the rough men in the room, but her voice was as strong as forged steel. She held a small, faded blue ledger book. This is my account book, she said, her voice clear and steady. From the laundry. Every spring, I mark the days the men cleared the ditch. I paid them in wash or bread. She opened the book and pointed a finger at a page. Her voice rang out. Elias Rohr, 5 days' work clearing the upper bank, 3 years ago. She wasn't finished. She looked around the room, her gaze locking onto man after man. Jonah Pike, I see your name here. Thomas Flynn, Samuel Jones. Half the men in this room have worked that ditch. It is ours. We maintained it. We kept it alive. Jonah Pike's deep voice boomed from the side. She's right. I was there. We all were. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Men started nodding. They remembered. They had worked that ditch. They had earned that water with their own sweat. Boone's fancy paper suddenly seemed thin and worthless. Judge Phipps rubbed the stubble on his chin. He was a freighter, a man who understood sweat and work better than he understood legal seals. Hard thing to claim a man stole what he helped build with his own hands, he said slowly. He looked at Boone, then at the angry faces in the crowd. Until this is settled proper, I'm suspending Boone's eviction order, and the charges against Elias Rohr are dismissed. Elias felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He had won. They had won. But as the crowd began to cheer, he saw the look on Silas Boone's face. It wasn't the face of a defeated man. It was the face of a predator that had just been momentarily thwarted. The smile was still there, but it was sharp and cold as a shard of glass. That night, the Golden Nugget was loud with celebration. But in a dark corner booth, Silas Boone was not celebrating. He sat with two men, the kind of men who kept their hats pulled low and never looked you in the eye. He slid a leather pouch heavy with coin across the table. The North Fork of the ditch, Boone whispered, his voice a venomous hiss. Tonight, break the slow gates. Make it look like a careless accident. A flood will do what the fire couldn't. It'll wash out those shacks, and this time, they'll be begging me to take the land. The two men nodded, pocketed the coin, and slipped out into the night like shadows. Outside, a cold rain began to fall. Elias, back in the small, warm room with Lydia and the twins, felt a sense of peace for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. They had faced down the dragon and won. He had no idea that Boone had just unleashed two more, and they were heading for the water, armed with iron bars and bad intentions. The rain started as a drizzle and turned into a cold, steady downpour, drumming on the newly patched roof. It was a sound that should have been comforting, but Lydia felt a prickle of unease on the back of her neck. She was banking the fire in the stove when she heard it, a faint, unnatural sound cutting through the rhythm of the rain. Clink, a sharp, metallic sound, from somewhere up the creek near the diversion ditch. She went to the door and peered out into the black, rain-swept alley. Nothing, but she trusted her gut. A woman alone in Deadwood learned to trust her gut, or she didn't last long. There's someone at the ditch, she said softly. Elias was mending a loose rail on the twins' makeshift crib. He was on his feet in a heartbeat, his face instantly grim. The fight wasn't over. He'd known it. Stay here, he said, pulling on his coat. But Lydia was already grabbing her shawl. They won't be expecting two of us. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, mud sucking at their boots. The rain plastered their hair to their faces. As they got closer to the ditch, they saw it. A single lantern, its light shielded, bobbing in the dark. It cast a greasy yellow glow on two figures crouched by the North Fork gate. They were prying at the wooden sluice boards with long iron bars, and standing watch, his broad back to them, was a third man. Even in the gloom, Elias recognized the set of his shoulders. Sheriff Danvers. Boone's dogs, Elias growled under his breath. This wasn't just vandalism. This was a conspiracy, sanctioned by the law itself. They were trying to cause a flood, to finish the job the fire started. Lydia's mind raced. They couldn't fight three men, one of them armed. They had to be smarter. Her eyes darted to the big water wheel just upstream from the gate, its paddles turning slowly in the current. A heavy iron chain was used to lock it in place for repairs. The chain, she whispered, her voice urgent. If we can drop the chain into the paddles, it'll jam the wheel. The noise will stop them. It was a brilliant, dangerous idea. Elias didn't hesitate. He gave a quick nod, slipped off his coat, and waded into the churning, ice-cold water of the ditch. The current pulled at him, trying to drag him under, but he fought it, his jaw set. He reached the heavy chain, unhooked it, and with a grunt of effort, began feeding it into the path of the spinning wooden paddles. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The heavy chain hit the paddles with a sound like a cannon shot. Crack! The wooden paddles splintered. The massive wheel shuddered, groaned, and then seized with a piercing metallic shriek that echoed through the gulch. The saboteurs spun around, their faces masks of panic in the lantern light. Danvers cursed and charged toward the wheel, trying to untangle the mess. But as he splashed through the water, the broken chain whipped free from the wheel and wrapped around his legs, sending him crashing face first into the ditch with a strangled yelp. The lantern fell from his hand and was extinguished with a hiss. Plunged into total darkness, the two hired thugs panicked. They scrambled up the muddy bank and vanished into the night, leaving their boss floundering in the cold water. Danvers, sputtering and cursing, finally untangled himself and limped away after them, a defeated, pathetic figure. They had won again. Shivering and soaked, Elias and Lydia hurried back to the small room, their hearts still hammering with adrenaline. But the moment they opened the door, a new, more terrifying fear gripped them. Clara was crying, a thin, sharp, painful cry. Lydia rushed to the cot. The moment her hand touched the baby's forehead, she knew. Fever, she said, her voice tight with dread. She checked James. He was burning up too. The cold, the damp, the constant stress. It had been too much for their tiny bodies. Elias felt a familiar, cold dread wash over him. This was how it started. A cough, a fever. He had watched it take his wife. He wouldn't watch it take his children. The rain, he whispered, his voice hoarse with guilt. He had been out fighting Boone's battles while his own children were getting sick. Lydia didn't waste time on blame. She was already in motion, her fear channeled into focused action. She started a fire, put water on to boil, and began preparing her remedies. Willow bark for the fever, choke cherry for the cough. She worked with a desperate efficiency, her hands never still. They need milk, she said, her voice strained. Real milk, not from a tin. Elias was out the door before the words had fully left her mouth. He ran through the muddy streets, his mind racing. Who would have a goat? Who would help him in the middle of the night? He came back 20 minutes later, soaked to the bone, clutching a small clay jug. Old man Madson's nanny goat, he panted, his breath fogging in the cold air. He'll want a day's work in trade. Done, Lydia said, already warming the fresh, rich milk. They spent the rest of the night in a desperate vigil. They coaxed tiny sips of milk and willow tea into the babies. Lydia pressed warm, herb-filled compresses to their tiny, struggling chests. Elias sat at the foot of the cot, feeling utterly useless, watching the two people who had become his entire world fight for their lives. I can't lose them, he finally said, the words torn from the deepest part of him. Not after Mora, not after everything. You won't, Lydia said fiercely, her eyes never leaving the twins. He watched her, this woman who had taken in a stranger, who had faced down a sheriff, who had walked into a fire, who now fought a fever with nothing but herbs and sheer force of will. A wave of emotion, so powerful it stunned him, rose in his chest. It's not just them, he said, his voice thick. I'm afraid of losing you too. Lydia froze. The lamplight flickered, casting shadows on her tired, beautiful face. For a long moment she didn't speak. She just smoothed the blanket over the twins, then reached across the small space and rested her hand on his. Her touch was light, but it anchored him. Just as the first gray light of dawn began to creep into the sky, they heard it, the sound of hoofbeats. Not one horse, but several. Moving down the main road with a steady, deliberate purpose. Elias went to the door, his body tense, expecting Danvers to return with reinforcements. But this was something different. At the head of the riders was a tall man in a long duster coat. A silver star was pinned to his chest, glinting in the faint light. A U.S. Marshal. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, his voice booming through the quiet morning air, loud enough for the whole town to hear. By authority of the United States government, the marshal declared, I have here a warrant for the arrest of Silas Boone on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and destruction of property. Elias and Lydia looked at each other over the sleeping forms of the twins, whose fevers had finally, blessedly broken. They didn't smile. It was too soon for that. But for the first time in a very long time, they both allowed themselves to believe that the sun was actually rising on a new day. They had no idea the marshal's arrival would unearth a secret far darker and more personal than Boone's greed. A secret buried in the same collapsed mine shaft that had taken Elias's wife. The arrest of Silas Boone was a spectacle. When the U.S. Marshal and his deputies dragged him out of his fancy hotel room, he wasn't the smug kingpin anymore. His fine coat was rumpled, his hair was a mess, and his eyes were wild with disbelief. The whole town turned out to watch, silent and grimly satisfied, as the man who had tried to burn and flood them out was hauled away in irons. 2 days later, Sheriff Danvers was stripped of his badge. He didn't put up a fight. He just packed a small bag and walked out of town, a man who had sold his soul for nothing. A strange quiet settled over Deadwood. The immediate threat was gone, but the scars remained. The fire, the flood attempt, the fear, it had changed them. Then Jonah Pike hammered a notice to a post on Main Street. Creek Bank cleanup, all hands welcome. And something amazing happened. People came. They came from every corner of the fractured town. Miners stood shoulder to shoulder with merchants. Chinese laborers worked alongside Irish immigrants. Red Elk and his nephews arrived, showing everyone the old way of weaving willow mats to reinforce the banks, a skill worth more than any engineer's diagram. Women set up tables, serving hot coffee and bread. It wasn't just a cleanup, it was a rebuilding, not just of the creek, but of the town's spirit. Elias was in the thick of it, his strength and skill a marvel to watch. He rebuilt walls, set posts, and hauled timber, working with a tireless energy. Lydia was there every day, the twins bundled in a sling on her front, organizing food and supplies. She had become the heart of the community, just as she had become the heart of his life. But a new shadow was falling, one Elias didn't see coming. The U.S. Marshal, a man named Harmon, hadn't left town with Boone. He was quiet, watchful, and he started asking questions. Not about the fire, but about the timberline mine collapse months earlier, the one that had killed Mora. One afternoon, Marshal Harmon found Elias reinforcing the laundry's foundation. "Mr. Rohr," Harmon said, his voice casual but his eyes sharp, "I've been reading the original report on that mine collapse. Says it was a structural failure. Unfortunate accident." "That's what they told me," Elias said, his voice tight. He didn't like talking about it. "Funny thing, though," the marshal continued, chewing on a toothpick. "I found a timberman who worked that site, hiding out in another camp. He tells a different story. He says he saw blasting powder crates being moved to Shaft 4 the night before the collapse. Crates that didn't belong there. Says he was told to keep his mouth shut by Silas Boone's foreman." Elias stopped working. He felt a cold dread creeping up his spine. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Harmon said, his eyes locking with Elias's, "that I don't think your wife's death was an accident. I think she was murdered. The question is, why would Silas Boone want to murder your wife?" The world tilted under Elias's feet. Mora, murdered. The grief he had carried for months ignited into a white-hot rage. He had thought his fight with Boone was about water and land. But it had been about Mora all along. He just hadn't known it. The marshal's investigation sent ripples through the town, and one of those ripples washed up a piece of the past Lydia thought she had buried forever. Harmon, looking into all of Boone's associates, uncovered the name of Lydia's late husband, Jacob Carter. He found her down by the creek, washing blankets. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I'm sorry to trouble you, but I need to ask about your husband. The record says he died of a fever 2 years ago." "That's right," Lydia said, her knuckles white as she gripped the wet blanket. "According to bank records I uncovered," Harmon said, "your husband was Silas Boone's original partner in the Deadwood mining claim, a full 50-50 partner. Yet when he died, his share seems to have vanished, absorbed entirely by Boone. Did you know that?" Lydia's face went pale. He told me the venture had failed, that we were ruined. He died a few weeks later." "Ma'am, the doctor who signed the death certificate left town in a hurry right after. And he was a known drunk who'd sign anything for a bottle of whiskey," Harmon said, his voice grim. I think there's a good chance your husband met with the same kind of accident as Elias Rohr's wife. Lydia felt the ground give way. The man she had mourned, the failure and debt he had left her with, it was all a lie. She wasn't just a widow, she was the victim of a calculated, cold-blooded theft. Her and Elias. Their tragedies weren't separate stories. They were two ends of the same bloody thread, spun by the same spider, Silas Boone. Their shared grief and shared fight had just become terrifyingly personal. That night, the small room felt different. The air was charged with unspoken questions and a simmering rage. Elias finally broke the silence. Why Lydia? Why Mora? She was a geologist. She was better at reading rock than any man in the territory. She was mapping the timberline claim for Boone. As he spoke, a memory surfaced. A conversation with Mora just days before her death. She'd been excited, secretive. I found something, Eli, she'd said. Something big. Something that changes everything. It's not just gold in these hills. He had dismissed it as her usual passion for her work. But now, Lydia, meanwhile, was piecing together her own puzzle. Jacob's sudden despair, his fever that came on so fast, the way Boone had avoided her after his death. It all clicked into place with a sickening finality. They were two survivors of the same shipwreck, washed up on the same shore. The final piece of the puzzle came from the most unexpected source. One of the saboteurs who had tried to flood the creek was captured by the marshal's men. Faced with a long prison sentence, he started talking. His name was Pete Higgins, and he'd been part of the timber crew with Elias and Mora. Harmon brought him to the laundry, his wrists in chains. Pete wouldn't look Elias in the eye. I'm sorry, Rohr, he mumbled, his face slick with sweat. I never wanted no part of killing. Boone's foreman, he just said we needed to scare her. Mora, she'd found something in the rock samples from Shaft 4. Found what? Elias demanded, his voice a low growl. It wasn't just gold, Pete whispered, his eyes wide with the memory. It was something else. She called it pitch blende. Said it was rare, maybe worth more than the gold. She'd made a map, logged it all in a journal. She was going to expose Boone for filing a fraudulent gold-only claim, cheating the government out of the mineral rights. Boone couldn't have that, so he ordered the accident. A map, a journal, the proof that could not only convict Boone of murder, but unravel his entire empire. Where is it? Elias asked, his voice shaking with the intensity of his focus. The map, the journal. Where are they? Pete shook his head. I don't know. After the collapse, Boone's men tore her cabin apart. They never found it. She must have hidden it somewhere else, somewhere safe. Elias's mind raced, sifting through the memories of those last few frantic days. Mora, knowing she was in danger. Where would she hide the most important discovery of her life? He thought of the babies. They had come early, born in the chaos right after the collapse. He had been so consumed by grief and fear for them, he hadn't thought about anything else. He remembered packing their things, grabbing the one blanket Mora had just finished sewing for them, a simple flour sack blanket. His blood ran cold. He turned and strode back into the small room where Lydia was rocking the twins. His hands trembling, he took the old faded blanket from the crib. It was worn, stained, and unremarkable. But as he ran his hands over it, he felt it. A slight thickness, a strange stiffness in the batting, a line of stitches along the edge that was tighter, newer than the rest. With a small knife, Lydia carefully sliced open the seam. And inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a folded map and a small leather-bound journal. Mora's final words, the truth, hidden in the one thing she knew he would protect with his life. He had it, the proof, the weapon that could finally bring justice for Mora, for Jacob Carter, for all of them. But as he held the journal in his hand, the back door of the laundry burst open. Standing there, his face a mask of desperate fury, was Sheriff Danvers. And he wasn't alone. He had two of Boone's loyal men with him. They hadn't fled. They had stayed, loyal to their master's money. Boone sent word from the federal jail, Danvers snarled, his eyes fixed on the journal in Elias's hand. He said you might figure it out. He wants that journal. Give it to me, Rohr, or the woman and the babies pay the price. The final confrontation wasn't going to be in a courtroom. It was going to be right here, right now, in this tiny room that had become their entire world. Danvers and his men advanced into the room, their faces grim. They were desperate, cornered animals, which made them 10 times more dangerous. Elias instinctively moved to place himself between them and Lydia, who held the twins tightly. "It's over, Danvers," Elias said, his voice low and steady, though his heart was hammering. "The marshal knows everything." "The marshal ain't here right now," Danvers sneered, pulling his Colt. "But we are. The journal. Now." Suddenly, a deep voice rumbled from the alley behind them. "He's not alone." Jonah Pike filled the back doorway, holding a massive blacksmith's hammer like it weighed nothing. And beside him stood Red Elk, holding a sharpened hunting spear, his face impassive and deadly serious. The whispers of the town had traveled fast. The community they had rebuilt was now here to defend them. Danvers hesitated, his eyes darting from Jonah's hammer to Red Elk's spear. His men looked nervous. This wasn't the easy fight they'd signed up for. That moment of hesitation was all Elias needed. He lunged, not at Danvers but at the rickety table beside him. With a powerful shove, he sent the table crashing into the two thugs, sending them stumbling backward. At the same time, he yelled, "Lydia, run!" Lydia didn't need to be told twice. She bolted out the front door, clutching the babies, and ran into the main street, screaming for the marshal. Danvers, enraged, turned his gun on Elias. "You're a dead man, Roar!" But before he could pull the trigger, Jonah Pike was on him. The blacksmith moved with shocking speed, his hammer whistling through the air. It didn't strike Danvers, but it slammed into the wall right next to his head, embedding itself deep in the wood with a sickening crunch. The sheer force of the blow sent splinters flying and made Danvers cry out in shock, dropping his gun. The other two thugs, seeing their leader disarmed and the formidable blacksmith and Lakota warrior blocking their escape, lost their nerve. They threw their hands up in surrender just as Marshal Harmon and his deputies, alerted by Lydia's screams, stormed the alley. It was over. Danvers was hauled away in chains. His reign of terror and corruption finished for good. The journal and map were handed over to the marshal, securing not only a murder conviction for Silas Boone, but the forfeiture of all his illegally obtained claims. The pitch-blende discovery, as Mora had predicted, would change the future of the territory, its riches now belonging to the public domain, not one greedy man. In the aftermath, a profound peace settled over the small room behind the laundry. The threats were gone. The ghosts of the past had been given justice. All that was left was the future. A week later, Elias found Lydia by the creek, watching the clear water run over the stones. The twins, now healthy and strong, were asleep in a basket at her feet. He didn't have much. He had a job waiting for him at Jonah's Forge. He had the respect of the town. He had two beautiful children, and he had her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a narrow band of copper he'd twisted and polished until it shone like gold in the setting sun. "It's from a pump wire," he said, his voice a little shaky. "From the mine." He took a deep breath. "That first day I made you a promise, that I'd shelter you forever. I meant it, not just from storms or sheriffs. I meant a home with you." Lydia looked from the simple copper ring to his earnest, hopeful face. She didn't say anything. Instead, she gently lifted Clara from the basket and placed her in Elias's arms. Then she placed James beside his sister. She put her family into his hands. Then she held out her own. He slid the copper ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Their wedding wasn't in a church. It was right there, on the banks of Whitewood Creek, the place where they had first met. The whole town came. Jonah Pike stood as Elias's witness, Red Elk as Lydia's. Marshal Harmon, who had delayed his departure, officiated, saying it was the most important piece of justice he'd delivered in Deadwood. Elias and Lydia stood facing each other, the twins in a cradle made from the same pine boards he'd used to patch her roof. They didn't exchange fancy, memorized vows. They spoke promises forged in fire and fear and hope. "I vow," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion, "to keep you warm when the wind bites, fed when the table's bare, and safe from any shadow that falls. You will never, ever face a winter alone again." Lydia smiled, her eyes shining. "And I vow," she answered, her voice ringing with a strength that captivated everyone present, "to keep your heart safe in this home, to feed your spirit when it's tired, and to always, always walk beside you." That spring, the cottonwoods along the creek grew heavy with new leaves. Clara and James took their first wobbly steps on the grassy bank, chasing minnows in the shallows. Deadwood was changing. The law of the creek, the one Red Elk spoke of, was alive and well, written not on paper, but in the calloused hands and open hearts of its people. The story became a legend in those parts. The tale of the barefoot man with two babies who made an impossible promise, and the barren widow who was brave enough to accept it. They had built more than a roof over their heads. They had built a family. They had built a home. And at night, the single lamp they lit in their window could be seen all the way down the creek, a small, steady beacon of hope burning brightly in the vast, wild darkness. This story is a powerful reminder that the toughest frontiers aren't always on a map. Sometimes the wildest, most dangerous territory is the one inside the human heart. Elias and Lydia, they weren't looking for gold or fame. They were just two broken people who found a way to make each other whole, proving that the greatest treasure you can ever find is a place to belong. They showed their entire town that a community is a lot like a family. It isn't about blood, it's about who shows up when you need them most. What do you think? Was Lydia foolish to trust a complete stranger, or was it the bravest thing she could have done? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey back to the Old West, and you want to hear more tales of grit, guts, and the quiet heroes who really built this country, then do me a favor. Hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. We've got a lot more stories to tell around this campfire. Thanks for listening.